A young man named Jake discovers a portal to 1958 in the pantry of a diner. After several visits and experiments, Jake realizes that history can be changed. No matter how long he stays in the past, only 2 minutes pass in the present. Thinking that this discovery could be of great benefit to humanity, Jake decides to live in the past until 1963 to prevent the assassination of President John Kennedy. After years of tracking Lee Harvey Oswald, Jake finally stops him from shooting Kennedy. When he returns to the present, he expects the world to be a better place, but finds the opposite. Earthquakes are everywhere. His old home is in ruins, and nuclear war has destroyed most of the world. A distraught Jake returns once again to 1958 and resets history to put things back the way they were. This story, from Stephen King's 22-11-63, is a striking example of how changes made in the past can have unexpected and larger effects in the long run. This example is also relevant for understanding the concept of the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect refers to the idea that a small event, which may seem insignificant at first, can lead to large and unpredictable consequences over time. Even a well-intentioned action can snowball into a small snowball many years later, influencing other events and eventually leading to either very good or very bad outcomes. In short, it is impossible to calculate the outcome of the butterfly effect. Aside from the sci-fi story example I gave at the beginning, I am going to tell a real butterfly effect example about the assassination of President Kennedy. But first, don't forget that you can create a butterfly effect for this channel by clicking the subscribe button. The term butterfly effect was coined in the 1960s by Edward Lorenz, a professor of meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who studied weather patterns. Lorenz used the number 0.506127 as the initial data in his calculations to represent the current weather, and 0.506 in his second calculations. As you can see, the difference between the two numbers is only about 1,000th. However, despite this small difference, when the process was simulated on computers, it turned out that in just 2 months there would be severe storms in one region and calm in the other. Lorenz first called this situation the chaos theory, but this name was later called the butterfly effect theory. The connection between chaos theory and the butterfly effect is that if chaos theory is the chaos created by dominoes falling one after the other, the butterfly effect is a small touch of the first domino. On the other hand, if you're familiar with the term, you've probably heard the famous example. The flap of a butterfly's wings in the Amazon can cause a storm in the US. This example is the original version as told by Edward Lorenz himself, with many variations in different regions. Of course, we know that the flap of a butterfly's wings cannot actually cause a major storm, but this is considered one of the most perfect analogies used to explain the theory. Here are 3 real examples of the butterfly effect from history that explain how seemingly small events and decisions can have a big impact in the long run. Assassination of President John Kennedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States of America, was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Kennedy wanted to end the Cold War and redirect the war budget to science, space exploration, and education. If Kennedy had not been assassinated, American and world history would probably have taken a completely different course. Kennedy's failure to survive the assassination had its roots in an accident in his 20s. An accident while playing sports in his teens had led to a chronic condition in his lower back. Because of this condition, he suffered from severe back pain some days and had to wear a corset to alleviate these pains. On the days when he wore a corset, he had to sit upright. Kennedy was wearing a corset on the day of his assassination. When sniper Lee Harvey Oswald fired the first bullet, Kennedy's wound was not fatal. If Kennedy had not been wearing a corset at the time, he would have been able to protect himself by ducking immediately after being wounded and may have survived the assassination. However, his mobility was restricted by the corset, and he was forced to sit upright and was the target of the second bullet. It was an accident he had as a young man that years later led to a condition that restricted his mobility and resulted in a tragic assassination. Alternatively, how would the survival of President Kennedy have changed American and world history? The Cold War could have ended, more investment in science and space exploration, major reforms in education. Kennedy's vision could have opened the door to a more peaceful and progressive future for the world, or we could have faced an entirely different future that we could not have predicted. But in a butterfly effect, a series of small events and coincidences irrevocably changed the course of history. A compassionate soldier. Henry Tandy was a soldier in the British Army, and an incident on the front line towards the end of World War I dramatically changed the course of history. In the last days of the war, Tandy came across a wounded and exhausted German soldier. He had a gun and could easily have killed the enemy. But Henry felt it was morally wrong to kill a wounded and defenseless man. He lowered his gun and spared the German soldier's life. That soldier was Adolf Hitler, the future leader of Germany. Years later, Hitler became the head of Germany and started World War II. This war claimed the lives of nearly 80 million people. After all this chaos, Henry Tandy returned from World War I as a veteran and won many medals for his heroism. He returned to Leamington, married but had no children. Years later, he described the day and his feelings this way: "I didn't want to shoot a wounded man, and if I had any idea what kind of man he would become afterwards, I would have fired my gun without blinking an eye." The soldier, whose sole intention was to do good by sparing a life, carried complex emotions of regret, sorrow, and sadness until his death in 1977 at the age of 86. These feelings prevented him from finding peace for the rest of his life. Tandy's act of mercy that day paved the way for one of the most devastating wars in history. That is why every decision, big or small, even with good intentions, has a bearing on what happens in the future. Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution. In 1935, Norman Borlaug, a young scientist, was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. That year, on the advice of a professor, he decided to turn to plant pathology, and moreover, to carry out special studies because of his interest in that field. This decision on that advice would be the small beginning of a critical step that would later affect the lives of millions of people around the world. In the early 1940s, Norman Borlaug joined a Rockefeller Foundation program to increase agricultural production in Mexico. Moving to Mexico, he listened to the problems of local farmers and studied the low yield and susceptibility to disease of wheat crops in particular. In this process, he focused on developing disease-resistant and high-yielding wheat varieties through hybridization. Successful in his work, the scientist helped develop high-yielding grain varieties, improved irrigation facilities, modernized conservation techniques, and facilitated the provision of inputs such as hybrid seeds, artificial fertilizers, and pesticides to farmers. The high-yielding wheat varieties he developed became widespread first in Mexico, then in Asia and Latin America, helping to save millions of people from starvation. This process is known in history as the Green Revolution. Thus, Borlaug, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, revolutionized agricultural production and improved the lot of many people around the world. If there are people around you who are extremely interested in something, encourage them to specialize in it. Perhaps your small piece of advice, as in this case, could save many lives in the future. Of course, this person could also use their expertise for evil purposes. Joking aside, this theory is called the butterfly effect, and you never know what will happen. Also, if there are viewers who are stuck in the past and wish they could change it, I recommend watching the 2004 movie, The Butterfly Effect. I think it is one of the movies that explains this theory in the most beautiful way. Remember, life is full of surprises and nothing is certain. We should live in the moment, cherish our loved ones, and try to leave this world better than we found it.
Saving JFK is just a theory. You don't know what it's gonna change.
You know what I know? You save Kennedy's life, you make the world a better place. And that's what I mean about the butterfly effect.